Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar that we're offering. And first of all, thank you for taking time to join us today. It's a very busy time of year for everybody. So thank you for taking an hour out of your day for your own personal learning journey. My name is Cindy Lindsay, and I am the co-director of Learning and Network Engagement with Community Foundations of Canada. I am calling in from my snowy home in Elora, Ontario. We had a good dump of snow last night, and so it looks beautiful. But I just want to share with you that I would like to acknowledge that I live in this area of Elora on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Wyandot, Mississauga, and Haudenosaunee First Nations. This is known as the people of the Between the Lakes Treaty and the Haldimand Tract. I am grateful for their stewardship of this land as we humbly seek to live together in pursuit of justice and right relations. So thank you for taking time, as I said, to join us today. We've got a lot of great content to share with you. And also just as a reminder that with our webinars, this is your time to learn, explore, and ask questions. So we do ask that you use the chat box. If you have any questions today of our presenter, please put the question in the box, and we will share it when it's appropriate or at the end, depending on our timing. And so I will now turn it over to my colleague, Tracy Vavrick.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Cindy. It is a pleasure to join all of you today, and we appreciate you taking your time to be with us today. Today, I'm connecting with all of you from my home in Grand Prairie, Alberta, Treaty 8 territory on the traditional lands of the Métis, the Kelly Lake Métis Settlement Society, and the Beaver First Nation. And I am committed to learning the history of the lands that I live on and how I can support the people who opened these lands and continue to strengthen the land that I call home. And I'm extremely grateful to share these lands with others who also as well are directed and supportive of continuing to ensure our lands are open, are inclusive, and provide a place for everyone. Again, it's a pleasure, absolute pleasure to have you. And as Cindy mentioned, you know, we encourage you to have the best experience possible. So we also encourage for you to turn off all your other platforms and take time for a learning environment today. Today, we are absolutely honored to have Manulife Investment Management team join us. And today we're going to be speaking further around building resilient portfolios and extremely, looking at the ESGs. Margaret Childe has joined us today, and Margaret has been with the company since 2017. And Margaret is the head of the Environmental, Social, and Governance Research and Integration. She is a lead and director with Manulife Investment Management. Margaret works and is responsible for collaboration and proactively supporting Manulife's direction in Canada-based investments, and to ensure that her team, she works closely with her investment teams on ESG. I always get those a little bit tied up, a little tongue-tied there, but in ESG integration and identifying and managing ESG risks and opportunities for Canadian portfolios. Margaret also works on global ESG integration projects and also methodologies for ESG product development, and represents Manulife's ESG's capacities among the local investment community. Margaret lives in Toronto. She's joining us from her home in Toronto today, and she loves hiking the Bruce Trail and spending time with her family, and this includes her border collie named Clyde. Margaret grew up in West Africa, Europe, and Canada. And if you live in the Toronto area, you may find her enjoying a walk along the Lake Ontario. So Margaret, it's an absolute a pleasure to have you join us today. We appreciate your time, your expertise, but also your sharing with our Community Foundation movement. Manulife has been a key lead in supporting our movement across Canada, and we appreciate that we are now able to come together and share together today. So Margaret, I'm going to pass it over to you now.
Tracy and Cindy, thank you for the welcome and for the acknowledgement of traditional landowners and First Nations. It's really my pleasure to be here today with you all. We have about 50 minutes or so to dive deep into a topic that is complex, is evolving, and has many different facets to it. So as noted, my name is Margaret Childe. I'm the head of ESG research in Canada at Manulife Investment Management. And I'm looking forward to spending some time just now to really dive into that intersect between sustainability and investing. So I know the Community Foundations of Canada have dived into looking at how they can have an impact on meeting the Sustainable Development Goals through their grant making. And you may be curious about how this flows through to the investment side of things. We all know that there's an ambiguity right now in our local economy, in our global economy, and the Community Foundations of Canada have granted more than they usually do in a particular year. So I just want to commend all of you for the extra and hard work that you've put in over the course of the past year. And we know that the ability to grant is linked to positive market returns. And it's at this point in time that the foundations may be taking stock of what they've done and how they can move forward to the next year. And there's that continued sensitivity around market returns to make sure that the grant making process is successful. But I want to say that that's the interest that we're seeing among the community foundations in terms of sustainable investing is something that I've seen grow over the last few years through my work with you. But I want to say also that that's reflecting what we're seeing on a global basis. Really, we're seeing more and more interest and an increased momentum around this field of sustainable investing. And it's going deeper as we're searching for those real world impacts across our respective value chains, if you will. So over the course of the next 50 minutes, we'll start off with a level setting as to what we mean by that acronym, and this space is full of acronyms, ESG, and we'll look at some examples in practice that I've taken directly from the investment teams that I work with on a daily basis here at Manulife Investment Management, looking at how ESG applies both in an equity space as well as a fixed income space and some nuances there. And we'll also look at the tools and methods for assessing ESG risk from more of a thematic perspective, looking deeper at climate change and the impacts and intersects there with portfolio management. And I'll wrap up with some key takeaways as we move forward. So to flip to the next slide, just kind of going into what we mean by E, S, and G. Institutional investors generally agree that ESG issues can have a substantial effect on a company's long-term financial performance. That was the conclusion that the US Government Accountability Office came to in its July 2020 report to the US Senate on ESG. So some examples of ESG factors include climate-related impacts, investments in human capital, and the strength of a company's data security program, for example. Investors are looking to ESG factors to better understand the risks and the opportunities that exist through portfolio management. And generally, we speak about those three pillars. The environmental factors consider how a company's operations impact the natural environment. You can think here, for example, water contamination from a company, but also how the environment impacts the company. Think, for example, a company's ability to operate in water-scarce regions. Social factors relate to the relationship between a company and its employees, its consumers, its suppliers, and the communities as well. The governance factors relate to the structures or systems put in place to ensure an effective direction and control of an entity such as a corporation or a nation. So what I want to highlight here is that the materiality of ESG factors will differ by industry, and investors are seeking that ESG information that is industry specific. We want it to be metric driven, and there's a focus on the financial materiality, which allows for comparability of ESG related data, which further enables the process of integrating the ESG factors into the investment process. One notable study I want to mention here is from 2016. The Harvard professor George Serafim used an ESG sustainability framework, which is focused on materiality and was developed by the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB as we know it. And he showed that companies that are focused on improving sustainability performance of only the material issues significantly outperformed the market over a 20-year period by about 4.2% on average. So what was unique about George Serafin's work in this situation is that not only that he found alpha or outperformance associated with the sustainability factors, but also that they were the ESG factors were different for different industries. Essentially, Professor George Serafin proved the materiality of sustainability, and that was a watershed moment for investors that is more closer in time to us. I do want to also just quickly highlight here that although companies have made a lot of progress in terms of their reporting on ESG factors, there's no standardized approach today. So there's a watershed of information. There's a lot of noise that investors have to dig through to find what's material to their investment process. So to give you an example there, we can pull from the financial filings of 2 beverages companies where water management is an important disclosure area. And we can look at how one company is using boilerplate information versus another, which is using metrics. So the first company is Molson Coors, and they highlighted in their annual financial filing that, to quote, climate change and water availability may negatively affect our business and financial results. Clean water is a limited resource in many parts of the world, and climate change may increase water scarcity and cause a deterioration of water quality in areas where we maintain brewing operations. The competition for water among domestic, agricultural, and manufacturing users is increasing in some of our brewing communities, and the above risk, if realized, could result in material adverse impacts on our business and financial results. A bit of a boilerplate disclosure here, which is not really useful for investors to determine the impact on the company. Now, compare that with financial filings from Diageo, another brewing company. And I quote here, overall this year, Diageo has delivered improved performance results across all water and environmental targets across various aspects over the course of this year. We reduced absolute water use by 9%, while water efficiency improved by 2.4% compared to the prior year. In water stressed locations, we have reduced water wasted by 12%, an important contribution towards our overall target of a 50% reduction versus the company's 2007 baseline. So you can see here the difference between the types of reporting that investors have to deal with, but it is improving over time. So moving to the next slide. Before I go through the slide, I just wanted to trigger the polling question, Tracy, if we could.
Thanks so much, Margaret. So we do have the poll up, and we appreciate if you could take a couple moments just to complete this for us. We're very close, Margaret. We've just got a couple more to complete the poll.
Fantastic. So while we're going through that poll, I just wanted to highlight with this slide, it's a quick visual of some of the nuances around the 3 pillars of environmental, social, and governance data and where we stand. So reporting on governance has been around for a long time. Investors are generally pretty comfortable with assessing the quality of management and the strength of a board, even if the data is not necessarily easily quantifiable. Environmental data has been easier to quantify, but there's a lot of inputs that goes into it, and the data tends to change from industry to industry. Social issues, they're less easier to quantify. They're more challenging for investment teams to incorporate into their evaluation models, but they're no less material, and ESG issues are often interrelated. So for example, think about a mining company and its social license to operate. It's critical, but that's often linked to how the company handles the environmental issues such as water management, or the governance issues such as the taxes it pays to a host country. So we are seeing some significant calls for standardization and comparability of reporting on sustainability data. And one important development I wanted to highlight to you quickly is the IFRS Foundation, which is responsible for the oversight of the International Accounting Standards Board, has been signaling that it will be setting up a sustainability standards board and just looking into the overall standardization of ESG metrics. It has also signaled that if this does happen, it will likely focus on climate as a first area of importance. So we are seeing a rationalization of this field, trying to simplify the field and understanding the complementary philosophy that can apply to different angles of sustainability reporting. So do we have the results from the poll?
We do. So you'll see I have the poll up again. And so we have a strong interest, very interest in response to A, and then B of
yeah, that's fantastic.
Somewhat interested. Yeah.
That's great. I mean, I think that's really reflecting again what we're seeing globally, that there is a general awareness and an increasing interest in these issues. Maybe there's less kind of understanding, or there's still some myths that we need to tackle in regards to sustainable investing, but we are seeing that general trend towards interested to very interested. So on the next slide, I just wanted to go over quickly here as a wrap up on why sustainable investing can be beneficial. So we're looking at the different themes here of governance, environmental and social factors, some of the challenges and the resulting opportunities. So for governance, the challenge to achieve success at an acceptable level of risk, companies need a strong independent board structure with diversity and transparency. The opportunity there is that well-managed companies facilitate a diverse range of views and challenge to the executive function, leading to better, more sustainable outcomes. On the environmental side, the challenge is that with widespread recognition of risks, including climate change, loss of biodiversity, and other threats, society is changing to penalize polluters through taxes or regulatory change. On the flip side, the opportunity is that companies with improving or better ESG performance will face less pressure and more sustainable business models over time. New products and services that can accelerate a transition to a cleaner, low carbon economy can unlock huge business opportunities. On the social side, a challenge is that companies face a risk of increased regulation and alienation of valuable business partners, employees, and other stakeholders through mismanagement of these relationships. Conversely, on the opportunity side, we see that companies that best manage these relationships with stakeholders build robust value chains across the board. So what we're seeing here in terms of the long-term outcome is long-term sustainable performance linked with a reduction in tail risk and a link to positive impact in the real world economy.
So Margaret, there's a question here from Jacqueline, and it's just interesting that that policy sits under the social side. Can you share the rationale for that?
So let's see here. Yeah, so in terms of policy, we're seeing increased, so to give you an example there, we may see, particularly in the supply chain, that there's, in the social supply chain, that there's increased regulation and policy as to how companies interact with their supply chains. In Europe, there's been, for example, a taxonomy that's been built out on sustainable factors. And one of the underlying criteria is that sustainable investing can do no significant harm. And it's linked to the Global Compact, for example, which focuses not only on environment, but also on human rights, on bribery and corruption, on the supply chain issues. So that's really where we're seeing increased focus in terms of policy and regulation that can be linked to the social factors. Thank you for that question. So moving on to the next slide, here I wanted to highlight that there's many different ways that investors can focus on ESG investing. And we've seen a significant rise in the past decade, but there's different ways that we can really approach this. On the right-hand side, we're starting off with ESG integration, and that's primarily what I've been speaking to you about over the last few slides. That's really a focus on integrating the material, environmental, social, and governance factors into the investment process and throughout the entire investment process. So that can include due diligence, risk monitoring, as well as stewardship and active ownership. Next, we have thematic ESG, and this strategy is really looking to consider companies that are better suited to fit the criteria and target sustainability themes that the investor has. So for example, later on in the presentation, I'll give you some insights as how we look at climate change through a thematic lens. Socially responsible investing has been around for a very, very long time. This is typically associated with investing in line with your values, and it may be usually accompanied by a set of screening criteria, for example, excluding alcohol or tobacco. So whereas the ESG integration approach may look at an alcoholic beverages company and look at how it deals with water management, the socially responsible investing side would look to likely exclude those types of companies. And then impact investing over completely on the left-hand side here is focused really on making a positive difference, positive environmental and social difference through the investment process. And financial returns can be secondary to the positive social and environmental impacts. So I just want to flip over to the next slide. One of the interesting things that I've seen as an ESG analyst over the course of the pandemic is that there really has been a stronger uptake of ESG among companies and investors alike. That's actually reflected in our own data that we're compiling from our clients as well. And it's interesting to see that the mainstream media here has been picking up on this. So companies and investors are changing their models in real time to deal with the pandemic. So for example, when I speak with an oil and gas company, I'm now hearing that their models are adjusted to take into account a double tail risk, such as the pandemic and a collapse in oil prices, which they've never had to really do before. So the pandemic has had a real world impact on how we're modeling out not only from an investment process, but also from a company strategic process on these big tail risk events. So as we move forward, I want to look through how ESG investing has impacted some real life examples of the investment process. But flipping to the next slide, before we do that, I want to look at the intersect of returns with sustainable investing. And I think that there's still a bit of a misconception that sustainable investing is limiting, that it's giving up that there's a concession in terms of your market returns. But increasingly, the data and the research is pointing towards a different conclusion. I mentioned the George Serafin 2016 survey, but there's numerous academic and investor surveys that are pointing towards the business case for incorporating ESG considerations in the investment process. And that's now well grounded in empirical evidence. Some of the associated financial benefits can include a lower cost of capital, improving operating performance, and stronger free cash flow. And those are exactly the kinds of words that my portfolio managers use when they engage with the investee companies on these issues. And it can be, for example, looking at the lower cost of capital associated with better diversity at the board. They're making those linkages. So ESG investing has been around for a while, but it's really started to go mainstream over the past 10 years or so. We do still see that criticism that ESG investing grew during a prolonged bull market, and we can't really draw any conclusive evidence from that. And the pandemic was the first time that we had a stress testing of ESG investing. So what we saw here is that companies that were perceived to have a preferable ESG performance outperformed their peers that were perceived by the public as having less responsible performance. So these companies that were perceived as behaving more responsibly had the less negative stock returns than their competitors. And that was highlighted by a study out of Harvard that looked at data from more than 3,000 firms between late February and late March 2020, just when we went through that global financial collapse, which really proved some interesting linkages between the value of sustainability and the investment thesis. In this chart in front of you, you can see the performance of an ESG index, the MSCI KLD 400 Social Index, compared with a non-ESG benchmark, the S&P 500. And we see that the ESG benchmark has increasingly decoupled from the regular benchmark over the past 3 to 5 years. And I think that's really reflecting the growth in ESG investing over this time period. And we see here again that the ESG index provided less negative returns during the pandemic. So moving on to the next slide. I've given you kind of the bigger picture, a more abstract look at ESG investing. But in the next section, I really want to walk through some tangible examples of ESG in practice, so you can get a sense of what it looks like at a more granular level. So for this first example, let's look at how ESG is integrated into equities. I'll provide an example from our fundamental equity team that's located here in Canada. Just to note that we've invested considerably in our ESG capabilities. I'm part of a 10-person team that's spread out globally, and we support our portfolio managers in really trying to provide a compelling downside capture. So we're looking at the ESG risks and opportunities in that fundamental bottom-up process. So this particular team is focused on free cash flow. They're looking for undervalued securities that are good quality and measuring this through the cash that those securities or these companies generate. And they've set up a structure to quantify all of the material ESG issues, measuring the impact on the cash the company can generate. And that allows for the ESG risks to be factored into the stock. And the teams focus on not taking too much risk, but also conversely, not leaving opportunity on the table. And through that structured process, working with the ESG team, working with myself, each name is reviewed in the portfolio, focused on free cash flow and the quality of the returns to integrate the ESG factors in the measurement of the cash returns. So I'll flip to the next slide here to give you an example of this in real time. So in this example, the ESG analysis was done on a Canadian software company. And the investment team thought it was a great company, but the company was allocating capital inefficiently, and that was being reflected in the returns that were declining over time because they were paying essentially too much for the acquisitions. So coming to that conclusion, the team engaged with the management of the company to let them know of their analysis and concerns. And through that dialogue, the company provided assurances that return on invested capital would be a larger component of their considerations when making acquisitions. And they also agreed to provide greater transparency on their compensation structure, really looking to incorporate the return on invested capital as part of that. So it's a good example here of the power of engagement and the power of ESG analysis, and looking at how an investment team can interact with a management team at a company to really provide that beneficial viewpoint for long-term sustainable returns. So flipping to the next slide, you'll have a visual here of what the investment team's valuation began with before the ESG analysis. after the ESG analysis, and then again after engagement with the company. So before the ESG analysis, the risk return profile was attractive. The shares could go up 20% and only take a 9% risk on the downside if things turn south. But after the ESG engagement, the investment team had concerns of the executive compensation structure and what the company was prioritizing, potentially leading to those inefficient allocations of capital. And that negatively impacted their risk return profile for the company, to the point that the team wasn't sure that it was an attractive investment in the end. But it was through that constructive dialogue with the company that they were able to come to a stronger conviction in the name and a stronger risk return profile, even beyond what the original assessment had given. And it's that approach of really looking at the ESG risks and opportunities, making sure that they're fully priced into the valuation process that allows the investment team to make decisions that have that full risk return profile in view. So moving to the next slide, I did promise you that I would give you an example of ESG integration or ESG investing from a thematic perspective. And so now I want to talk to you a little bit about the intersect of investing and climate change. So while we know that climate change is a big problem, it's often considered a problem for the future. But there's a growing number of investors that are recognizing the risks and opportunities from its systemic shift and are making capital allocation decisions in accordance with that recognition. So today, the concentration of carbon emissions is at its highest level ever over the past 800,000 years. So the scientists tell us at 413 parts per million in the atmosphere. And that's really causing alarming concern among the scientific community. And they've linked that to human economic activity since the Industrial Revolution. And they have their smoking gun, if you will, that points to the link to human activity. So there's a couple of different ways that investors can look at the increased ambiguity or uncertainty caused by climate change. And there's different scenarios that we face. We know that we need to rapidly decarbonize our global economy and stick to a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway or well below 2 degrees Celsius pathway, as the Paris Agreement has notified us. However, if we track the expected outlook or even a path of continued growth, this could lead to much higher global warming, even up to 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, which could lead to severe physical climate impacts on our globe. So investors need to balance out how they look at the intersect of the global warming and the increased physical impact with the regulatory policy and transition impacts that will play out. And what we really want here is an orderly transition, which will benefit everyone, investors, communities, the global economy. We'd all benefit if it was a nice, orderly transition. And we know the decision makers need to act very quickly to make that happen. So flipping to the next slide, that's really what the Paris Agreement is about. It's a framework for global climate action. There's 197 nations worldwide that have come together to sign the Paris Agreement, and it's a global commitment to keep the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels. And we know that there's a ratcheting mechanism within the Paris Agreement, which makes regulation more stringent as we move forward, forward in time, and that's going to happen every 5 years. So there is an expectation around the 2025 mark that this is going to become very, very stringent, and we're going to see a lot of increased measures in policy. So moving to the next slide.
Margaret, could I just jump
Yeah.
in here for a second? How do you see the climate events that we've experienced over the last year or 2 years? We look at the wildfires on the West Coast and in the North, and the escalation and intensification of hurricanes. How do you see that moving the needle from an institutional investor perspective?
Yeah, well, so I think that increasingly we are seeing institutional investors try to understand the science, try to understand and model out the potential impacts of various future scenarios. We're also seeing investors making the capital allocations to decarbonize their portfolios by reducing the carbon emissions of their holdings. But more and more what we're seeing is a move from a backward-looking approach, such as the carbon footprint of your portfolio, to a forward-looking approach. What are the different scenarios in the future? How do they impact the investment returns? And two important movements that have come out of that are, one, the Climate Action 100 Plus, which is a global investor initiative of more than 400 institutional investors globally, more than 35 trillion in assets under management, that are seeking to engage with their investee companies, particularly the largest greenhouse gas emitters, to focus on three things around climate. One is improved governance, the second is improved disclosure, and the third is to reduce emissions across the value chain. And those discussions have been very successful. More needs to be done, but it is a 5-year engagement process. We're about halfway through at this point, and there has been some notable commitments that have been coming out. I have a Climate Action 100 Plus engagement tomorrow, actually, with a company in Alberta. It's been a successful engagement. We've seen some targets come out of that engagement, and we continue to engage on that front around climate. Another notable initiative that has come out is the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. This is a group of about 5 trillion in AUM among asset owners that have made a commitment to decarbonize their portfolios over a long time period. Their goal is 2050 to reach a net zero greenhouse gas emissions state at that time. Quebec's own La Caisse is part of that initiative. And it's really about making real world impacts. So engaging with companies to decarbonize over time is the preferred route to divestment in that situation as well. So moving on to the next slide. So we've become quite aware at Manulife Investment Management of the intricacies and the nuances around climate change. We've had our investment teams trained by climate scientists from MIT to understand this very complex science, and we've increased our stewardship approach around this. We're part of Climate Action 100 Plus. We were one of the founding members on that. We've gone deep into scenario analysis and the impacts on our portfolio from different temperature rises and what that could mean for us and our clients. And we've also been recognized by the PRI for our leadership in climate reporting. The PRI is the Principles for Responsible Investing. So moving forward, I'll give you just a kind of a quick peek as to what I mean by scenario analysis. It's really looking at the impacts on our portfolios under different future climate scenarios, whether it's a 1.5 degree scenario, a 2 degree scenario, or a 3 degree scenario. There's many different possible outcomes, but this, by limiting it to 3 or 4, it helps us to focus our attention. And we're looking at the impact from a deep reduction in carbon emissions and the resulting impact from policies to a scenario where there's less stringent policies and an increased likelihood of those physical impacts of climate change, such as sea level rise and drought, severe storms, and increased rainfall. So we take into account the coupling of the physical impacts, the policy impacts, as well as the potential opportunities that may exist from a transition to a low carbon economy. And we look at that through the technology and the patents that a company may have. And that gives us an output of a climate value at risk number, which we can aggregate up at the portfolio level. So moving on to the next slide, I'll give you an example in practice of scenario analysis. This time looking at it from the perspective of a fixed income team. This example was taken from the Canadian fixed income team. And it's a bit of a different approach when you talk about fixed income. You're really looking at protecting from the downside risk. So when it comes to looking at the downside risk, the ESG analysis is really fundamental to that overall approach. The credit analyst team takes a hard look at the overall sustainability of the various industries in which they invest, and the impact of the appraisal on specific companies' business risks, as well as the fair value spread of a company's bonds. So in this example you're seeing here, we're looking at Canadian pipelines, and you can see that depending on the pipeline company, they can have a very different asset portfolio. So the different colors here represent assets like oil sands or conventional oil pipelines, natural gas. One pipeline company may own a regulated utility, and another may own nuclear power generation assets. So there are meaningful differences between the different pipeline companies, but the credit rating agencies will rate them all the same. They're all rated BBB, all within the same, area code, if you will, in terms of credit quality as measured by the credit agencies. And they spread at their spreads trade at are incommensurate with these credit ratings. So moving to the next slide, you'll see here that it's really up to the investment team to better understand and have a deeper dive than the credit rating agencies into the potential risks from climate change, for example. And in this example, they've looked at how resilient the companies are under 3 climate scenarios. The business as usual scenario, which the team sees as the base case scenario, reflects what the market has priced in as the average asset life for the various types of assets. The orderly transition scenario models the impact on the average asset life if Canada and the US were to implement policies in the coming years that are consistent with the Paris Agreement or a net zero target for greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And we just saw Canada make a move in that direction on the 19th, actually. So it's quite conceivable that this will be legislated into law by the current Liberal government. Then finally, the disorderly transition scenario models what could happen if countries really delay those efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and are forced to make more drastic measures that disorderly transition at a later date in time. And that scenario is where we would see a higher risk in terms of stranded assets, as general energy consumption would need to be abruptly curtailed to respond to the more imminent physical impacts that we may see from climate change. So on the right side, as you can see from the chart, some pipeline companies have more resilient assets than others if we measure by the weighted average asset life according to the various scenarios that we just looked at. And that's a reflection of their unique exposures. And this really provides some perspective to the investment teams beyond what they're seeing from the credit rating agencies, beyond what they're seeing from ESG rating agencies, that allows them to make that nuanced investment decisions, particularly when you think about the duration of a bond. So just going to the next slide here. So if we look at whether a company has sufficient assets to cover its long-dated bonds and the impact of climate risk on long bonds on different scenarios, we can see that taking into taking into account the downside risk and the guideposts for climate can really provide you with a better informed view of when to enter and exit the existing spread levels on a Canadian pipeline, particularly for its long bonds. So that intersect between sustainability considerations and investing, sometimes we need to have a timestamp as to when we see that risk or opportunity present itself. And that can be done over a 5, 10, 15, or even 30-year scenario. So I'll just flip to the next slide here. So what I want to highlight again on the theme of climate is that we're seeing an increased focus among regulators, among governments, among investors, really looking at the intersect of capital markets and climate change. And we're seeing a lot of innovation in this space too among investors. So looking to actively incorporate the climate metrics, not only as an overlay to the investment process, think about like a carbon footprint, but as a critical element in the investment selection process, really marrying together the classic fundamental metrics of investments with the measurements of climate change in a more sophisticated way. So flipping to the next slide, we've done quite a bit of work on this area ourselves. So one thing I wanted to highlight to you here is that there's an increasing move towards the forward-looking metrics and assessments of the intersect between the environment, climate change, and our portfolios. And one interesting development is from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. You may recall Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg started up that task force as mandated by the Financial Stability Board. And the TCFD, as it's called, launched a consultation on forward-looking climate-related metrics for the financial sector, in particular, the implied temperature of investments. And the implied temperature rise metric is really an attempt to estimate a global temperature rise associated with the greenhouse gas emissions of entities in a given portfolio or strategy. And that can be expressed as a single temperature unit or range even that's comparable to potential climate outcomes that we see with that 1.5 degree, 2 degree, 3 degree scenario, for example. So just to note that this view on the portfolio is already being used by major institutional investors globally. In fact, the Government Pension Investment Fund, the largest pension fund in the world in Japan, is already publicly disclosing its temperature alignment of its portfolio. So I think that this could be a notable development that we see in the future, and it's certainly one that Manulife Investment Management has been doing a lot of work on. So please stay tuned. So moving on to the next slide, I just want to start to wrap up here by saying that from our own analysis, we're seeing a lot of asset owners becoming more sophisticated and knowledgeable about their requests on ESG. This is actually a snapshot from our RFP and DDQ database. So these are all the questions that we're receiving in from our investor clients. And you can see that there's a notable year-over-year increase in the hits that we're getting on ESG questions. But it's not only the increase in ESG questions, those questions are also becoming much deeper. So go back a few years, they might have asked us a question like, are you a PRI signatory? Do you have an ESG policy? Now they want evidence and just more transparency as to what's happening at the strategy level. They want to understand specific examples that we can give. They want to understand our proxy voting and engagement process. And again, really linking it to the investment process. So I just wanted to highlight that trend. So moving on to the next slide here, this is just to kind of bring it all home for you. Really, it's not about seeking blind ESG exposure. There really is a method to the madness. It's really about seeking increased returns and reducing that risk over time. And sometimes when we talk about risk, it really can be that systemic risk, whether it's a systemic risk in terms of a lack of diversity, the impacts of climate change, increased geopolitical risk. Those are all issues that investors are trying to manage to achieve the sustainable long-term returns. So this is an example of how ESG is taken into account throughout the investment process, whether it's through the due diligence, the ongoing risk monitoring, our interaction with experts in the NGO and academic field, as well as through our stewardship, our proxy voting, our engagements with companies over time. So to wrap it up on the next slide, I just want to say a big thank you for sticking with me throughout all of this. Oh, I have 2 more slides to go. So the next slide is really giving you an example of where we're seeing things going for in the engagement side of things. So stewardship is becoming one area where investors are increasingly demanding real world outcomes. And this slide gives you some examples of the real world outcomes that we're seeking to achieve. So for example, it might be setting a greenhouse gas reduction target with a Canadian oil and gas company. It might be an acknowledgement of ESG risks and increased disclosure by a US consumer staples company. It might be asking a Chinese insurance company to recognize the risks from climate in its own portfolio and process and joining Climate Action 100 Plus. And so on. So some real life examples of how investors really can move the needle in terms of addressing systemic risk. And that's really what we mean when we say sustainable investing is resilient investing. So moving on to the next slide, these are my key takeaways for you. So during a market crisis, the search for evidence of resilience has been amplified. We've seen that through the pandemic, and we'll continue to see that moving forward. And the measure of a company's sustainability comes down to how resilient and agile they are at handling many different stakeholders, the global uncertainties, shocks, and disruptions. And that's regardless of whether they're caused by a pandemic, social unrest, or an environmental emergency. And we expect companies to demonstrate the strategic vision and capabilities to achieve and maintain strong ESG performance. In other words, we're looking for that long-term resiliency and the ability to manage the tail risks. And it's incumbent upon investors, upon asset owners, to really make that demand through their investment process as well. So I'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much for joining me on this ESG journey, and I encourage you to ask any questions you may have.
Great, thank you so much, Margaret. This is a lot of information and great information as we explore this area of our work. So we have a question here, and folks, if you do have a question, please put it in the chat box, and because we've got a couple of minutes before we wrap up. A quick question: what are questions community foundations should ask their investment managers to learn whether they consider climate impacts?
A great question. I mean, I think that the tools are becoming more sophisticated as we move forward to look at the different scenarios that may play out and the impact on the portfolio. I think for us, there's a couple of key things we needed to do in order to look at the impacts of climate change seriously. One, we needed to understand the climate science. We went and we did our homework. We educated our investment teams on the science. We brought in climate scientists to provide that overview. Number two, we joined critical initiatives that are underway in terms of developing the tools, the climate fintech modeling necessary to have that different perspective on the portfolios. Number three, we engaged with the academics and NGOs to better understand the lay of the land and how we can also be involved in making an impact and having that orderly transition to a low carbon economy. So I think in your shoes, I would just begin by having that discussion. Ask your asset manager what they're doing in this space, what sort of evolutions they're looking at, what kind of data sets they have access to, how they're intersecting with various stakeholders around this.
Great, thank you. And sort of building on that then, when and how do you decide as a community foundation whether to engage with other investors or with a company directly around its ESG efforts? So as we start to look at our investment policies and how we engage with investors, any thoughts or reflections on that?
Well, so I'll give you maybe an analogy on the other side. I was having an engagement last week with a large mining company, and the discussion was around diversity. And I was, encouraging the company, and my investment teams were present in that meeting as well, to really set targets and have a policy around diversity on a more comprehensive view. The dialogue was fine, but there was no kind of real takeaway conclusion. The independent lead director, it was a board level engagement, called me back later in the week and said, I didn't feel satisfied with the way that discussion went. I want you to know that it's critical for us to hear this from our investors so that we can bring those messages back to the board and we can begin to implement the change. What he was really trying to communicate to me is that companies need to hear this message. So that's for the asset manager dealing with the investee companies. On the flip side, the asset manager needs to hear this from their clients. They need to hear from the asset owners that this is something that they care about and they want to hear about it. So I think you can easily make that link through the investment value chain that way. And I would encourage you to join initiatives that you are really passionate about. The Climate Action 100 Plus initiative has been extremely beneficial for me to interact with peers in this space. We learn together, we develop the agendas together, and we can have like that communal impact.
Great, thank you so much. Any other questions, folks? And if not, Tracy, I'll turn it over to you because it is pretty close to the top of the hour.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cindy. And Margaret, thank you for your in-depth and very informative presentation today. I can see lots of thoughts, and there was, watching the chat box today, this was very valuable. This is very valuable information that is really important for all of our leaders that are with us today, and for them to continue this conversation as they go back to their community foundation with their board, with their senior staff leaders, plus also as well with their investment team. So thank you again, Margaret, for your immense time and for being so caring to share with our movement. That means a lot to all of us. And as we go forward, we're very excited to have a few more webinars before the end of the year. We invite all of you to join us for our Feminist Grant Making webinar that we're hosting this Thursday. So Thursday, it'll be at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And it's around looking at our practices and how we shift our practices to a more promising world in regards to our lens, excuse me, in regards to our lens as we are granting back into the communities. We also, as well, on November the 9th, have our Treasure and Finance Fundamentals session, and this is a third of a third-part series. And this specifically will be focused around risk management. We are very fortunate to have a key leader, Gord Hawley, who is also a member of the Community Foundation Board of Directors, who has been running through these series and has provided some very valuable information around the differences on community foundations. So really encourage you, if you have time to join us, do join us. These sessions will also be updated and added to our resource library that is on our website. But it's always valuable to be on site with them because you can ask the questions and also dive deeper with Gord. Our third session that I've got noted here on our screen today is our start for 2021. Yes, we're moving into 2021. And our first session will be on January the 13th. And we're going to be diving deeper into exploring what is trust-based philanthropy and what does this look like. It's a perfect opportunity for you to join us to explore different ways of how you are looking at your granting from at all levels or to all other different areas within your organization. So do encourage you to join us, or if you can't, to have others from your community foundation team join us for any of these sessions. Plus also as well, Cindy and I are just finalizing the 2021 program. So follow our events page, which the link is noted here. And also all of our events that are public events will be also posted on the resource library. So friends, as we leave today, thank you so much for joining us again. Your time is valuable, and we appreciate your interest in moving forward and exploring how environmental, social, and governance resources are important and necessary as we look at our investments. As we leave today, I also say to all of you, stay safe. We recognize the challenges we're all facing through the pandemic, and we thank you for what you're doing. Please stay safe, and all the best to each of you.
Thank you.